Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this afternoon. We are going to be talking about leadership development in nonprofits with an expert in that area. I'm Joanne Florino. I'm the Adam Meyerson Distinguished Fellow in Philanthropic Excellence at the Philanthropy Roundtable, and I am thrilled to be joined today by Cheryl Taylor, previous president and now board member at the Foellinger Foundation in Indiana. So Cheryl, why don't we start by having you tell us a bit about the Follinger Foundation, its history, its mission, and the area of the country in which you fund.
Excellent. And thank you so much. I'm very appreciative to the Roundtable and to you, Joanne, for this opportunity. And I'm really looking forward to the questions because we all learn so much from each other. So the Follinger Foundation was established in 1958 by Helene Follinger and her mother, Esther. Helene was the owner and the publisher of the afternoon daily newspaper, the News Sentinel, which she inherited when her father died unexpectedly in 1936, and she was 25 years old. So an interesting place for a young woman to be in that time frame. So when her father, not only did her father pass away, but her only sibling subsequently died in a vacation accident. And so there were no direct descendants. So the foundation was the recipient of the work, frankly, of Helene's incredibly strong business acumen and of the philanthropic and charitable instincts of herself and, of course, of her mother. So in early 2000, the board was composed of people chosen by Ms. Follinger specifically to serve in that role, and or others who had worked for her or who knew her very well. Probably most important is that the board chair was the gentleman that Ms. Follinger had specifically chosen to be the president, to run the organization, because he embodied the characteristics that she valued. So he encouraged the board to spend substantial time documenting donor intent, which I know is near and dear to your heart. And this included articulating the key principles that describe Ms. Follinger. And those principles, those values are integrity, accountability, responsibility, and results. These are the values of Ms. Follinger as a leader, and they became the values clearly of the foundation. This effort then also led to a clarification of her vision, which she had very, very forthrightly set out in a 1955 speech that she had delivered, where she was talking about the importance of people helping people to help themselves and then ultimately to help one another. It was really an early statement about the importance and the value of community and how we all need to work and help each other. So we maneuvered that around just a little bit. So we're really talking about helping people move from dependence to independence, thus to interdependence. And then the foundation's mission, that's the vision. The foundation's mission, of course, is supporting effective organizations with adaptive leaders that serve children and families most in need. One of the ways we got to all of this work, of course, is spending a great deal of time looking at Ms. Follinger's papers, speeches she delivered, having conversations with people who knew her very well when she was alive, and really looking at her initial grant making. These were really important things for us. And a couple of years later, I actually worked very hard with the gentleman who was the then board chair and highly pressured him, which he subsequently did, into creating about a 60-minute video, which gathered his insights into her intentions and what it is she valued, and most importantly, the types of people that would subsequently be leading the foundation.
So you're a place-based foundation. That's also part of my background. And I suspect that many of those who are on the call today are also place-based foundation. So let's talk a little bit about the relevance to what we're going to discuss of being place-based and describe the community that you serve.
Oh, absolutely. So we are physically located in Fort Wayne, Indiana. That's the northeast corner of Indiana. We border in this northeast corner, both Ohio and Michigan. Fort Wayne is the center of this particular region. And Ms. Follinger, it's interesting that you asked that question. She was she was very adamant about maintaining the fact that this was a place-based foundation. One of the former board members was constantly quoting her. She would say, I made the money here and you all will spend the money here. Now, there is as you also say in your book on donor intent, you know, it needs to be guardrails, but we don't need to be hamstrung. And so it's very clear in this day and age that a lot of the local organizations provide services to people beyond this particular county. They would be perhaps in a 8 to 10 county regional space. So the foundation will still support those organizations, but the majority of the people they serve are in this county.
So what inspired the development of the foundation's leadership and capacity building programs? I'm really curious about, you know, how this came about and how the Follinger board also discussed it and decided to adopt this process.
Well, and if it's all right with you, let's take them separately, because although they all come under, in my head, the rubric of providing additional technical assistance and support to nonprofit organizations, they sort of devolve on different paths. So our board has, you know, always understood the value of giving people time to think about where they are, think about where they're going, think about what it is they need to do. And we were actually have been providing capacity grants since the middle 1990s. In those days, we called them strengthening organizations. And then when the field decided it was, I think, more interesting or more appropriate or something to call them capacity grants, we of course switched over to that particular language. So as the capacity grant process evolved, it was clear to us that, you know, we would better serve organizations if we could not just have one generic capacity opportunity, that they would be more useful if perhaps they were targeted. So for example, there is one capacity grant that's very technical in nature. This could be succession planning or strategic planning or financial planning. It's very, very technical, very specific focused, and you're pretty clear on what the end result of that's going to be. A second grant was really focusing on organizational culture. And that's sometimes a difficult thing for organizations to get their head around and perhaps even have a collective opinion that they want to do that. A third grant was a result of a pilot project we did on our 50th anniversary. We call these Inspire grants, and they essentially allow either the board leadership or the staff leadership or both to take a break, if you will, and recharge, almost a mini sabbatical of some sort. And then the fourth one, which we call Breakthrough, this is the one that is for the wild idea that an organization has that they don't have time to really think through. They don't have the funding to think it through. At best, it might have a 50-50 chance of being successful. It's probably more like 25-75. But you know, we think this is where the innovation stuff can most occur. So we added that particular type in order to encourage people to think about that.
I have to jump in here and ask you if you've had any of those that have worked out.
Well, we have one. We had one. This is actually a result of a project that we did for our 60th anniversary, where we offered the breakthrough opportunity. And the board had allocated up to $400,000 for these sort of, just what they sound like, breakthrough, creative, wild ideas. I mean, you had to have some sense of, you had to have some vague kind of a plan, but you know, what the end result might be, who knew? And they did approve one of those actually to our local innovation center for roughly $275,000, I think it was. And that's what triggered us to say, hey, we can't just offer this as an opportunity, you know, on some unidentified time frame that works for us. We should make it a capacity grant, so that if people are interested in doing it when the time is right, they can submit. So we've been doing that for a long time. Also related to capacity, we've been offering all kinds of training opportunities, workshops. We've had lectures from what I would say known and not so well-known people in the nonprofit sector. We've done some individual training on specific topics that are, you know, financial related, et cetera. I think, I'm not sure we're the best place to be doing that. And then we also created a nonprofit leadership award. for a board member, it's really emphasizing the importance of board members digging in at a governance level, but digging in and making a difference for their organization. And so while we recognize that board member, their organization will also receive a $25,000 operating support grant. So that's the capacity piece. When you asked me the question about leadership and also how did I present that to the board, and I'm sure you're going to have some panicked people on this call when I say this, and the answer to that is I wrote them a 25-page paper. Now, I recognize that not everybody's going to do that or even want to do that, and not everybody's got a board who's going to read that. But, you know, we come out of the newspaper business, right? Background. So reporting and editing is a really valuable thing. And I, as an aside here, I do want to add the importance of our teams. I have a wonderfully creative colleague who took that paper, pulled in all board chair photos, added pull-out quotes and graphics. So this just really wasn't 25 pages of words. But what the paper allowed me to do, it was almost my own version of the Inspire, is step back, look at everything we had, and outline how to best present this to board and marshal all the relevant information, starting with Ms. Follinger herself and her own role as a leader. And then I followed that through basically 25 years of annual report statements where the board and all of those various times said this, this, and this. And you can see the continuity of the attention paid. So it wasn't just in 2015, hey, let's do this big leadership program. It's essentially, we've been talking about this since the founders and we've been building up to this. That's how we got to all that.
Okay, I should stop for a minute and just ask a couple of questions that I suspect people might be wondering about. So who does the actual training for the foundation? How do you figure that out? And I guess the other question is, how does this relate to your annual budget? What percentage of your grant making budget would you say now is going to the capacity building and the leadership programs?
Those are great questions. So the capacity grants themselves are part of the overall grant budget, right? So we are categorizing our organizations by the work they do, children, youth, families, or whether they're just community entities. And 90% of the funding goes into the children, youth, and family category. So if an organization is one of those, somebody who does that kind of work, then that capacity grant would come out of that part of the grant making budget, right? So if the total grant making budget in any given year is, let's just say it's $8 million, $9 million, 90% of that 8 million is targeted towards children, youth, and families. So if organization X is one of those, then they're coming out of that particular pot. I will say I had a report run, well, everything's pre-COVID, isn't it? Probably in January, and I was interested in how many just outright capacity grants had been awarded in, I believe, the last 15 to 17 years. And it roughly is somewhere around $4.5 million worth of those. The leadership program is different. It's a direct charitable activity. So it doesn't specifically come out of the grant making budget. The original investment in that was about $1.35 million. And my most recent look at that, we're close to about $2 million.
Okay. And then who does the actual training?
Well, in terms of the leadership program, we have an outside consultant. We put this program together utilizing his work. We had our evaluators in up front. I know you're going to want to talk about that. We had them in up front to help us put this program together. We had key staff people. We had conducted a number of focus groups. We had a lot of feedback from nonprofit execs. And we had 2 or 3 of them that had a lot of training background around the table with us in the development of this. But the actual leadership program is delivered by an independent consultant.
Okay, that actually answered one of my questions, was whether you worked with your grantees in designing the programs. So these kinds of programs require an incredibly high level of trust, I think, between the funders and the grantees, because in many cases, the grantees are exposing to the funder their weaknesses, the places where they lack capacity, where maybe they really even lack the correct staff in place. And the leadership, I think, especially where you're bringing in, executive staff members who clearly they have to feel the need themselves for some personal development. So I wonder, do you think that being place-based is an advantage in this because you've developed relationships over the years, or can it be a disadvantage because on some level you all know each other so well that you may let some details about where there are gaps or weaknesses just slip by?
Well, on any given day, I could probably answer that question both ways. But I think the best answer for us is your first answer, which is it makes it a lot stronger. So again, in the capacity grant arena, when we work very hard with people to say, this is an opportunity, we're happy to try to provide you the support. If you come to us and say you need help with strategic planning, we are not going to interpret that as the fact that you don't know what you're doing. In fact, we're going to interpret that much more that you really do know what you're doing and you're looking for some additional resources. Now, on the other end of that, when you reapply for your operating support grant, we're going to look and see, did you do that strategic? Is that strategy now guiding the work that you're going to do? But I think people finally understood that. Probably the fact that we've been doing this work for so long helps to underline and support that. In terms of the leadership program, while that program, again, up until COVID, was operated within the foundation's building, none of us ever went in that room. I went in the first day and welcomed everybody. Sorry about that. But it's always this independent consultant who does not report back to us. Person A said this, person B said that. It would be a huge problem for him in terms of ongoing work, but it's a bigger problem for all of us. We were very clear about that firewall. And when the evaluators work with all of those people, they're asking questions, but they give us reports that are in the collective, right? It's aggregate data. And everybody in the executive program, we're probably going to talk about some of these components, has their own executive coach. And that arrangement is made between that nonprofit leader and that executive coach. And they give us no feedback, nor would we ever ask for it.
Okay, that's a great procedure. We do have a question, and it goes right to what we're discussing. Can you please provide an overview of the leadership development program, who participates, desired outcomes, et cetera?
I can do that. So there are two components to this big leadership initiative, right? One component is specifically directed at nonprofit staff, and the second component is directed at nonprofit board leaders. And I think probably this person's question, it might be mostly interested or mostly around the nonprofit staff piece, but please don't let me forget the board part, because that's crucial to any organization. So there is an executive leader wing, if you will, and what we called rising leaders. Everybody calls our younger folks something different, but we kind of like that term because it didn't necessarily mean you had to be very young. You could just be rising within the organization. Both programs are 12 months long. What was very important to us when we put this together is that this is not a focus on technical skills, right? These are not sessions on how to read a financial report, how to put together an audit committee, how to supervise your people, none of that. So the sessions are on negotiation and difficult conversations and personal storytelling and vulnerability and how that affects you when you're working with other people, which may in fact have something to do with supervising other folks. But it's very specific about that. It can be gray in certain areas. And both programs really focus on those very broad adaptive leadership skills, right? It's cohort based, 12 people in each group. There's one group of executives. There have been two groups of the risings We pay lots of attention to our evaluators, and one of the many things they came back and said to us is, well, that's nice that you got the executive people, but there are lots and lots of rising leaders, and how are you going to get more of these people into the mix? They also said to us, which was to me more important, that if a person is a rising leader and they learn something different, or they would like to go back to their organization and have a different approach, there's strength in numbers. Sometimes it's difficult to go back and say to, any of us as the boss, have you thought about doing it this way? But if there's two people who come and say, could we think about this? It makes it a little bit stronger. So subsequent rising leader programs brought in pairs of people from the same organization. So there's one executive program, two risings. They all have an experiential learning component. Again, now all of this is as I said, pre-COVID. The theory is, they would go away for 2 or 3 days. They would go to another city in Indiana, and everything was experiential. As I mentioned earlier, everybody in the executive leader class has an executive coach. I personally did make a big point here. All of these coaches are certified executive coaches. They all have nonprofit experience, and almost all of them do not live here. I thought it was really important that they didn't live here because they didn't know all the chit chat in the grocery store or the dry cleaner. I think that's really very valuable. So then so now what are we doing for the risings, right? So we approached people who had participated in an earlier rising group and said, how would you feel about coaching people in the subsequent risings? So the past year, they had their own training on coaching, and this current year, they're all matched up with other rising leaders. We think that's really important because it allows a person who's completed the program to still get some ongoing learning and education themselves, to also engage in that and provide that coaching for upcoming risings. It matches all kinds of people who don't necessarily know each other. And, one of the key outcomes, of course, is making sure that the pipeline of really great adaptive leaders are in place. That's one of the key goals of this whole project.
And you were going to talk about board training.
Oh, the board training. See, thank you very much. So we did take $400,000 of this initiative money. We've got a donor advised fund in our local community foundation, which is named after one of our former significant board leaders, who was a community model of how to be a nonprofit board leader. And so we utilized the funds through the BERT fund to identify trainers for board members. Now, these topics are a little more technical. So, financial information for board members. What should I know what should I know about finances as a board member? What do I need to know about personnel as a board member? What is my role in terms of governance? How do I really be engaged in strategic planning? What are the significant changes that are on the horizon in the world of nonprofits, and how does that affect what my job is as a board leader? We actually have 3 of these scheduled. That was something that moved virtually a lot easier, actually, than a lot of other things. And typically there'll be somewhere between, I'd say 20 to 30 nonprofit board leaders who participate in those particular sessions and seminars. The goal, of course, is to take that back to their own organization and share that information with them.
Thank you. I have another question, but I also want to remind our listeners that the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen is open and ready for you. So please enter your questions there, and I'm going to be checking them, and if they're timely to what we're discussing, I will ask them right away. Otherwise, we'll wait until the end of the interview. So you talked about bringing people in cohorts. And I'm familiar with the leadership program that created small cohorts of nonprofit executives who then became coaches and cheerleaders for each other over multiple years. And, I learned about that when I was at the foundation, and it does seem to me that there's so much value to that aspect of the program. So I want you to speak a little bit about the kind of programs and events you've put in place to encourage those cohorts to continue, and maybe even encourage them to become coaches for other leaders. I see you're doing this with the Rising Leaders program already. But what about the executives or even the board members?
It's less likely with the board members because it's the same group of people do not necessarily attend each seminar. So that's part of their challenge, and they're very specific. You know, you're trying to be cognizant of board members' time. So some of those don't really exceed more than 90 minutes or 2 hours at the most, because everybody, and we all know this, everybody has 100 things on their plate. In terms of the executive, well, for everybody in the leadership program, this has been one of the things I was most grateful for. This is essentially sacred space for all of them, right? They become extraordinarily connected to one another and stay connected to one another, and they share information in that you know, my understanding, what they will tell you themselves at some point is very, very personal. And they are coaches for one another. They're a support system, and they are coaches for one another. You know, we attempted not nowhere near this well thought out version of a leadership program a number of years ago, which, as I said, didn't work very well. But the key component of it that did work was this fact that everybody came together and they stuck with their group. Most of the cohorts, in fact, keep themselves running. But you did remind me of a piece that I forgot for your person's earlier question. There is an alumni event. So something is created every year for anybody who is an alumni, whether of the executive program or the Rising program. And it's ongoing education, but it usually has, it's certainly not an entire day, and it usually has a sense of fun and activity around it. So that's a really important piece too.
Okay. So we've got a few more questions, and I am loving the second one because I think that this is true of many professional development programs. There's been some talk in the sector about leadership development possibly leading to frustration because they're unable to implement what they've learned in the context of their organizations. Have you heard any feedback like that? And if so, how have you been able to minimize this kind of frustration?
Well, I'm going to turn that around just a hair and tell you a story, which I think in a way is very much related to that question. Not in the group that just finished, but the prior year's program in the executive program. Halfway through, one of the executives within her group came to the conclusion that she was not executive director material. And I have to tell you, I think that's fabulous, you know, that you come across with such a wonderful piece of self-awareness, because this program has said, you know, this is not where I need to be. I don't have the energy or the time or the commitment or the inclination to do all these things that are required. And so, you know, that worked out pretty well because she left and went and worked for a different not-for-profit in a much different role. And they found another person who was, you know, more inclined to do that. I think we see, you know, we are following people. Everybody who's been in these programs, we're following them. You know, did you get a promotion? Have you moved to a different not-for-profit? You know, we know the people that left the nonprofit sector for the for-profit sector, right? And I think, I mean, again, I think that's a good thing. If we know ourselves and we know we're better off someplace else, then that's good for me. That's good for the organization. That's good for everybody that you're touching. I think that the COVID issue has created an entirely different challenge for people. The group that just finished the most recent program, it was very hybrid, right? They had eight months in person. So the good news for them was that they were able to make these relationships up front and go through the experiential learning component, which, as we all know, is very helpful to cementing those relationships. They did the last 4 months virtually. And what I think is going to be really interesting is the group that just started, they're in person again. You know, appropriately spaced, lots of distance, you know, the foundation's a big building, they've got a lot of space. And I think that it's going to be fascinating, to your person's question, what this group decides, because they are starting this program totally immersed in this particular emergency, which is not what the prior groups have been.
Yeah, that is true. And I have actually been planning to ask you about how 2020 had affected your leadership program. So thank you for all those stories. We do have another question, and I was going to move to evaluations, so I'm glad we've got this here. Have you identified specific desired outcomes? And if yes, could you share them and how you're measuring and reporting them?
Oh, sure. Again, as I said, so the foundation has a history of anytime it is engaged in a major initiative, it always has an outside evaluator. And, this is a place for me to really congratulate. This is one of the great strengths of the Follinger board, whether it was the Follinger board in 2000 or the Follinger board today, right? They're different people clearly, but this is one of the great strengths, and this is built into the culture, that this is really, the outside evaluation is considered an investment in our investment. And in my personal story about this is a number of years ago, a long ago former board member said to me, don't they tell you 75% of what you already know? And my answer to that was yes, I want to know the other 25 because we want to fix it. We always do formative evaluations, right? We want to fix things as we're underway. We're not looking at, okay, this is what happened and it's over and wasn't that great. So, what are we going to do about that? This particular program, as I mentioned earlier, I think the most significant impact on this is on the individuals themselves. When people tell their stories, when they have a consistently safe space in order to grow, we see that a lot of these people, sort of the contra to your question to me earlier, what do we know? A lot of these people just come up and, not anymore, but they would come out and just tell me that. This is my story. Here's how I really feel I can do a much better job. Here is what, we think helps us. And you can kind of see it in then the capacity grants that come, because if somebody has that new flowering of, yeah, I can be a leader. Oh gosh, I could go try this. Here's an opportunity to do that. So we really wanted to build up the existing nonprofit leaders, and we wanted to propagate this pipeline. So we also know from research, it's somewhat dated, but that basically for every dollar that's spent in the nonprofit world on leadership education and training, there's somewhere between $23 to $25 spent in the for-profit world. And when you look at that imbalance, it was so critical to us, especially because we're saying we want to support effective organizations led by the most adaptive leaders. Well, how are people going to get there? So that, again, watching how people then run their organizations, what kind of changes do they make, what do they stick to? Those are ways that we can see that. And because we're place-based, and the early group of people who went through these programs were all of our existing grantees, you can see that in both the grant requests and in the subsequent conversations.
Okay. I thought of a question I did want to ask you. Is the foundation ever proactive in suggesting gently and graciously to your grantees or others that they should take part in any of these programs?
Well, we invite everybody into the leadership program. So that's kind of gently suggesting, wouldn't you think? I mean, if you get an invitation, from either the former CEO or now the current CEO to say, hey, would you like to participate? And there's some significant intentionality there. Also, again, thanks to our evaluators, we mix and match groups in these cohorts, right? Our first group we ran were all human service organizations because it's where the bulk of the money goes. And the evaluators came back and said, they're lovely people. They always say, that's nice, Follinger. And then there's always a but. So they say, that's really nice, Follinger, but people don't live in just a human service world. They live in an arts world and an environmental world. And so then we mixed everybody up. So we started out with just our grantee organizations. Our current group has members of the grantee organizations, and then some other really interesting and I think important groups. We went to some of our other foundation colleagues and said, hey, we want to expand this and invite other people in. And who do you see as really good prospects, or who do you see as organizations that potentially could benefit from this? I think that's to your point, genteelly, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is typical of a small community or a smaller community, I think. Well, there's a question here from one of your colleagues. Kent Lanham is asking, how did some of the other local leadership programs take your efforts in this nonprofit space, as there are the usual broad community leadership programs that were historically sponsored by the local chamber?
Great question. Thank you, Kent. One of their jobs was for us to go and explain why this was different. First of all, who our audience was. It was very specific to nonprofit organizations in this particular arena. And even a place as small as we are, the most recent data we've seen is there's somewhere around 1,800 to 2,000 nonprofit organizations in this region, right? I mean, to me, that's a big number. And, the bigger your city, right, the bigger those numbers get. So, this isn't a competition. We're actually not looking at the same people, first of all. And secondly, we're not offering the same kind of education and training. To Kent's point, our local chamber also runs a leadership program, and it's excellent. But we went to them and, talked about, this is what we're trying to achieve, and this is what you're trying to achieve. And is there some place where they can come together? And one of the things they're actually thinking about is when the chamber's recently launched its Leadership 2.0. One of the things they're talking about is there some way where people who've been through the Follinger leadership program a couple of them might also participate in this? It's a great question. It's our job to tell people what we're doing and to look for those potential places of competition up front. And make sure that we're talking to each other.
Thank you for that. You changed. This could be a very quick answer, but it's a 2020 question. Have you changed the program structure or content in any way this year? Obviously, you've had to go virtual for a period of time, but what about content? Has content included kind of going through a crisis, preparing for what would be a really tough 2021, et cetera?
Well, the short answer to this is yes. Not only did a lot of it change, it wasn't an all-day program anymore. It got condensed into about 90 minutes because none of us want to sit here the entire day, right, doing this. We know that that's not good for us mentally or certainly physically. So that was a big change. The concepts were delivered in a different way by the consultant. He often got a third party who was an expert in that topic. He might do a video with them and show that, and then engage the group around that conversation. What actually happened, however, is he didn't even need to say, today we're talking about leadership in crisis, because what actually happened, and again, I don't know this because he told us this. I know this from people in the group who shared it because they were comfortable with that. Again, we're not spying on these folks. They came back and said, that was great that this topic, was about negotiation this time around, but we needed to know what was happening with us daily, right? So almost all of those conversations ended up about, what was going on with them personally, what was going on in their family lives, what's going on in their organization, what are we going to do? What are we going to do about fundraising? How are we going to fundraise virtually? And again, their groups, I think, provided that space that you're talking about. So yeah, that's an absolute wonderful question. I think the great thing was that our consultant was savvy enough to say, hey, this may be the topic, but we're going to talk about what people need to talk about.
I'll be very curious to know kind of down the road if some of the participants can get back to Follinger with just a sense of how much this helped them prepare for 2021 and for potential really big changes in their organizations, whether because their budgets are beginning to crash or they're really beginning to think of some kind of restructuring, whether it's internal or mergers and more collaboration with other organizations. So I think it gives you a laboratory that we all wish you didn't have to ask how these may have helped organizations get through the crisis. But I'm going to go back to a few more questions. We're actually right back to the beginning. Cheryl talked about the importance of donor intent and values of the foundation. How does Follinger apply these to the organizations that are chosen to participate in this type of program, as well as the activities that are actually conducted?
Well, again, so the primary values, integrity, responsibility, right? Accountability and results. And, just when you think of the last three and think about what kind of person Ms. Follinger must have been, I mean, it's pretty clear what she thought, was important, right? And so that's our starting point before any sort of program or initiative or grant making opportunity is provided. So this is how I think we led to clarifying, we want the most effective organizations, right? Accountability, responsibility. And the integrity piece, of course, is the primary umbrella virtue, and led by the most adaptive leaders. And so, for me, everything got operationalized out of those values. That's why the mission statement has been gently modified a little bit over the years. The vision statement not, but the mission statement gently. And I think to the person's question, again, most of the people who were originally participating in this were our grantees, so we already had a significant knowledge about them because we're place-based and because we are pretty strongly adhere to the grant making guidelines and principles. We know who most of our grantees are. We've known them for a long time. And maybe this will help answer the question. We're not an in and out organization. It's not, 3 years and you can't ever get funded again. I mean, there are some organizations that have been receiving funding for 20 years. There's some organizations that are also brand new, but we're pretty serious about how we review and engage.
Well, this is a related question. Does this type of training add to the potential ability of a nonprofit to successfully apply for a grant? Kind of like a good housekeeping seal of approval.
That's a great question. Well, I guess I will say it this way: just because somebody who went through the particular program does not necessarily mean they're going to get a grant. What we're looking for is, and it's to your earlier question, is there something you gained from all of this that shows up in how you put together your grant, and or more appropriately, how your organization is going to work in the future? Was this learning more about how to do good negotiations? Did this help you as you were working on your negotiations for your state funding grants or something? Did something in this process come back to you and say, hey, I don't need a new $30 million building. I can do XYZ. So I think they're looking for those kinds of things. Sure.
Okay. I've got 2 more questions, but I actually want to remind folks on the call again that we are taking any questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I think we've got about 15 minutes left in the webinar, so you can get your questions in there now. So I've got a quick one on capacity building. One listener wants to know if you include fundraising and storytelling of capacity building programs.
Great question. And this is a perfect question. Fundraising, no. The premise is financial sustainability, yes. So fundraising is a piece of financial sustainability. So if an organization wants a capacity grant to look at financial sustainability, which would include, should I keep these programs? Should I not keep these programs? Am I fundraising here? How do I do that? Then yes, absolutely. But just fundraising in and of itself, no. Storytelling in and of itself, no. If we want to create a communications plan, which is going to be how are we communicating about everything we do, which not only is our external communication piece, but how do we communicate with one another? How are we communicating with our volunteers? What is the plan? Absolutely. Everything is about, it's a level up than a specific task. Again, unless it's strategy, right?
Okay. You mentioned, it was very helpful for me to understand that the capacity building program grants come out of the grant making budget. but obviously you're operating direct programs in the leadership area. So what does that, if you can share this, what does that leadership program cost approximately? And I know there are multiple elements to it. There's a leadership award, as well as different levels of leadership training. So what, on an annual basis, what do you think the foundation is spending on the leadership programs?
On the executive and rising leadership programs themselves, probably, and this would also include the delivery of it, and would include the evaluation. I would say somewhere in the vicinity of probably $250,000. The board training, as I said earlier, we put that in a donor advice fund, so that's a $400,000 grant.
Okay. Okay.
All of this could be done for, I mean, no, you know, like, for example, I mentioned the executive coaches, that's an expensive piece of all of this. And, you know, there are 6 of them, they each have 2 people. I mean, there are some components I think that wouldn't have to necessarily be there, but I do think those components are some of the things that people most need. And in this particular time frame, I think we all need a coach.
Okay. Is participation a competitive process, or is anyone who signs up allowed to attend?
This is an invitation process. So it's not.
This is for the leadership. This is for leadership.
For leadership, right. It's an invitation process. So you can't just sign up. You are invited, and then, I mean, for the most part, everybody who's been invited has participated. Right.
Okay. What about on the capacity building side?
Since it's a grant making piece, any eligible local nonprofit organization, 501c3, correct status, everybody's in good standing, could certainly be an applicant for that. One of the things I did miss about this, which I think is very important, we used to have very specific applications for the capacity grant. It was on our website. Now, if you look at our website, it says, you know, call the director of programs, because what we found is that what everybody wants is slightly different. And so she has a conversation with them, and then they craft specific questions for what that organization is trying to do. And there's never more than 4. Right. You know, this is not we're not writing War and Peace here. This is, you know, just to the point. The other thing is, I'm surprised somebody hasn't asked me this. We don't have a list of verified consultants that people can use. What we do say is you must use a consultant who has expertise in the area in which you're talking about and has done that with other nonprofit organizations. And you need to tell us who those other nonprofit organizations are. A lot of times there'll be a really small group. They might call and say, I don't know any of these people. What we give them back then are names of other organizations who have done capacity work, and similar to what these people are trying to do, and say, you go call those executive directors, find out who they used and what their experience was. So they're the recommenders, not us.
Okay. So about how many distinct organizations would you say are touched each year by both the capacity building and the leadership offerings?
Oh, I didn't plan for this one, Joanne. I'm going to say,
and don't blame me, this came through the Q&A box.
Yeah, off the top of my head, I'm going to say probably, I don't know, 50.
Okay. I guess the question that keeps coming back to me is the relationship between these kinds of offerings and the fact that you're place-based. And so I just want to let you talk kind of at your own, you know, pace about the sustainable value of these types of programs for place-based funders in particular, because that's the world I come out of, partially in my own grant making experience, where you are typically funding very much the same organizations every year in some sort of capacity. And sometimes it's hard to step back and wonder where this is all going in the longer run, you know, in the big picture. Are you moving the needle on these organizations at all? So I love the idea of adding these different components to what might be your general operating support grant making, because it seems to me that that's how you begin to see some kind of change in a relatively small community. So from Fort Wayne perspective, I'd love to hear you talk about that, what you've seen over your tenure as president, in terms of how these programs have enhanced your place-based funding.
Well, I mean, in many respects, you've done a great job of teeing me up for that. So by definition, right, if the foundation is place-based, the selection of grantees is limited. Now, your place-based could be one county, it could be 9 counties, your place could be half the United States, but you're still place-based, and you still have some form of limitation. As I mentioned earlier, I think our number is 1,800 or 2,000, which I still think is extraordinary. But when you're still limited. But once you consider organizations in the context of donor intent, the earlier questioner was talking about values, right? And I said earlier, Ms. Follinger's vision, helping people help themselves to help one another, right? That we are all hopefully moving along this continuum to independence. So when you start looking at it from that point of view, again, your number of prospective participants in grantees is more limited. So our theory was we provide critical opportunities to the people who run the organization, to the people who run the organizations, board and staff, and we provide critical opportunity, capacity grants, to the organizational entity, okay? And that together, those things can make both the individual stronger, which by definition should make the organization stronger. The theory of change here is that the stronger that organization is, the better they are able to serve their consumers, their clients, their customers, the people who utilize their services, and therefore the whole thing is much more effective in terms of community. That's the theory. I think, again, we see it because it was so much in line with Ms. Follinger and her own perceptions of leadership and being engaged. So we see this as clearly related to donor intent. But we do look at the participation in all of these various components in terms of then what do those organizations actually do and how are they able to, I want to say more than consistently, how are they able to actually deliver on their own particular missions? What adjustments do they make? What changes could be in place? What new things do they see? What new partners do they create? Who's going to merge? I forgot that. We have been the only, that's not true, excuse me. We in our community foundation together have funded a number of mergers over the last couple of years, all through this capacity grant process too. That's another statement, right? If an organization decides to merge, that's making a better community too, we think, if in fact it's the most appropriate thing for them to do.
Well, I've got one final question for you. And again, the Q&A box is still open for questions. We've got a few minutes left. Do you ask your grantees to do any kind of surveying of their clients around satisfaction with services? I mean, the assumption is this is making for better service delivery. Is there any attempt to reach those who are being served directly by the organizations to get some feedback? Would you think about that as a way to measure improvement over a period of time?
That's a really great question. The short answer is we have not done that. Quite honestly, I hadn't even thought about that. A lot of organizations, as we know, have a certain level of accreditation, and in the process of doing that, one component of all that accreditation is finding feedback from the people who do receive the services. I think if we did that would have to be an extension of our own of the work we do with our own evaluators. I'm not sure we could put that on these organizations, say, hey, by the way, here's something else for you to do. We need you to, survey the people who receive your services and see if they're, receiving them in a better way. It's an excellent idea. And this again was why I so value these kinds of conversations, because it never even occurred to me. It's a great idea, and it's certainly something that ought to be on the table.
And I do agree with you that funders have to be responsible for making sure that those organizations have the capacity to do that kind of surveying. So I don't see anything else on the list, but Cheryl, I think folks can go to the Foellinger Foundation website and get more information about these programs if they're interested. And if anyone has questions after the webinar, you can send them to me. It's jflorino@philanthropyroundtable.org, and I will pass them on to Cheryl to answer. So
I do have one thing I'd like to add, if I might. Last year, we had a videographer follow 2 of the people in the executive program and 2 of the people in the Rising Leader program. Followed them through both the 8 months in person and the 4 months virtual. So we've got a documentary about this. It's roughly, I think, 30 minutes long. And Ed Kalmanowski, my successor, just announced yesterday that that's going to be public in a very short while. And if anybody's interested in that, we can certainly make sure that they get that. This is where people who've been through the program really talk about what differences made to them, talk about storytelling, right? What differences made to them and how this applies not only to their jobs, but to their lives. So we're happy to make that available as soon as it gets rolled out.
Last call for questions. And if there are none, I just want to say thank you again to everyone who joined us this afternoon. A special thank you to Cheryl Taylor, and I will tell all of you, this was intended to be a breakfast roundtable at a live annual meeting in Naples, Florida in October, which we would have enjoyed very, very much. But when that meeting went virtual, we decided to turn this into a webinar. So I hope that, again, if you have any follow-up questions, you'll get them to me at the Philanthropy Roundtable. But I want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. And Cheryl, many thanks again. This is a great topic. I hope you'll all think about using some of the things you learned today here, especially if you're a place-based foundation. And with that, I'm going to close the webinar. So thank you all for coming. And thanks you again, Cheryl.
Thank you, Joanne. It was wonderful.